Okay, so live from somewhere near Dayton. Play it again, Sam.
Okay, um, good afternoon now, everyone. My name's Sam Wright. My thesis is about attitudes towards mentally ill people. And mine was sort of inspired, I think probably a lot of people, they watched a lot of, Criminal Minds or NCIS, a lot of those sort of police procedural type TV shows, and that got them interested in criminal justice. But going back and watching a lot of those shows, I thought, wow, they don't really represent mentally ill people that positively. And so I wondered if that had an influence on people's attitudes towards them. And so, just sort of a background, my lit review, there was one study that had men and women take the community attitudes towards mental illness questionnaire, and it found that women were more open-minded and positive towards mentally ill people compared to men. And then an average American household watches more than 7 hours and 50 minutes of television each day. So that's quite a big chunk. And then a survey from 2007 found that 87% of the respondents relied on TV for their information about mental illness. So it's definitely something that people rely on. So more specifically, there was a study in 1994 that surveyed 168 hours of different TV programs, and they identified in total around 127 characters that were portrayed as male, and that was whether they had lines. And of those, 33.9% were portrayed as perpetrators of a murder, rape, robbery, and/or non-simple assault. They also went further, and they had different types of TV shows, and they found that genre does affect the frequency and tone of portrayals of mental illness. So in the crime dramas in the sample, over half of the characters that were mentally ill were portrayed as violent criminals, compared to only 11.8% in the other dramas. Another study found that the mentally ill characters committed violent crimes at a much higher rate than is accurate to real life. And they also found no evidence to support the claims made by these TV shows that mentally ill people are more violent or more criminal. Another study looked more closely at the amount of TV watched and people's opinions towards mentally ill. So college students worked on a survey that they considered TV an important source of information on mentally ill people, were asked exactly how much TV they watched each week. And the study found that the more TV people watched each week, the less likely they were to feel sympathetic towards mentally ill people, and they were also less likely to support deinstitutionalized care or mental health facilities in residential neighborhoods. So they felt like they didn't want mentally ill people near them. So my empirical questions were, does gender influence people's attitudes towards mentally ill individuals? Does mayor influence people's attitudes towards mentally ill individuals? And then does the watching of police procedurals influence people's attitudes? And does the number of hours watched each week affect these attitudes towards mentally ill people? And my hypothesis for this was that I thought that criminal justice majors would have positive attitudes towards mentally ill people compared to people not in that major, because they would experience more knowledge and learning about mentally ill people that might combat these influences. And my other hypothesis was that the higher number of TV shows and the higher number of hours watched each week would influence attitudes towards mentally ill people. So my design, it was a 2x2 factorial between subjects, non-repeated measures design. And so it was male criminal justice major and male non-criminal justice, and then female criminal justice and female non-criminal justice. So I had a convenience sample of 102 subjects from the campus of Tiffin. basically just going to classrooms and the CAF and asking people if they would like to participate. I explained the purpose of the study, and they all received an informed consent form that they then signed. This form was collected and kept separate from their questionnaire. They had a demographics page and a questionnaire to fill out. I created the demographics page myself, so it asked their gender, their age, their major, which was phrased as criminal justice or non-criminal justice, the number of police procedural TV shows watched, and the number of hours these types of TV shows that they watched each week. Now, the questionnaire was an excerpt of an already existing one called the Attitudes Towards Mental Illness 2014 Research Report. It was 37 questions with a 5-point Likert scale for each question, ranging from either 1, which was strongly disagree, or 5, which was strongly agree. And then some of the questions were reverse coded. So 1 might become strongly agree, and then 5 would become strongly disagree. This is my demographics page, just to show you what it looks like and how it's phrased. I gave an example of the types of TV shows, so if they didn't know what police procedural meant, those were some examples. And then I broke them up into either 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, or 5 shows or more, and then same thing for hours. Again, this is just an example of the questions from the questionnaire. It's not all of them, but it's just sort of indicative of the types of things that it asked. So whether they would want to live next door to someone who is mentally ill, whether they thought that mentally people should be excluded from certain jobs or things like that, those types of questions. So the results that I found, well, first of all, the subjects I collected, the female criminal justice major pool was a lot larger compared to the other ones. So I removed a random selection of those subjects to make the groups more equal. For the questionnaire, a high score meant that they had a more positive attitude toward mentally ill people, while a low score meant that they had a more negative attitude. The data was analyzed through t-tests and correlations. So correlations were run for the questionnaire scores and the number of shows and number of hours. And then after that, I did a median split for questionnaire scores, so to separate them into either high or low attitudes, depending on the score. And then I ran a t-test again for those and a couple other different variables. So this is the means for each group. The possible means could range from the lowest score of 37 to the highest score of 185. As you can see, female criminal justice majors scored the highest, but most of the scores were fairly close to each other. So this was a comparison of male and female questionnaire scores. It was statistically significant. Females had significantly higher scores, which means they had statistically significant more positive attitudes toward mentally ill people compared to males. This is a comparison of major. It was not statistically significant, so there was no significant difference between the two majors on their questionnaire scores. This is a further breakdown, so we have female criminal justice compared to male criminal justice majors. It was statistically significant. Female criminal justice majors scored much higher, and so they had more positive attitudes compared to male criminal justice majors. This is a comparison of female non-criminal justice compared to male non-criminal justice. It was statistically significant, and once again, female non-criminal justice students scored higher, meaning that they have more positive attitudes compared to the male non-criminal justice. This was a comparison of male criminal justice to female non-criminal justice. Female non-criminal justice students scored significantly higher, which again means significantly more positive attitudes. This was female criminal justice compared to male non-criminal justice. It was statistically significant, and female criminal justice students once again scored higher and had more positive attitudes compared to male non-criminal justice majors. Now, there were no significant differences between male criminal justice and male non-criminal justice, and there were no significant differences between female criminal justice and female non-criminal justice students for their questionnaire scores. Now, shifting to the TV questions, there was no statistically significant difference for gender and number of hours watched. There was no difference for major and number of shows watched, and there was no significant difference for major and number of hours watched. However, I did find a statistically significant difference for gender and number of TV shows, and I found that females watched a greater number of shows compared to males. As far as attitudes, there was no statistically significant difference for the attitudes in the number of TV shows watched, nor was there a statistically significant difference for the attitudes and number of hours watched. So basically, the number of TV shows and the number of hours did not influence their attitudes, whether they were high or low. So discussing these results, obviously gender was found to have an effect on attitudes towards mentally ill people. Females had more positive attitudes. Surprisingly, major did not have an effect, and it seems that gender is a very strong influence because female non-criminal justice majors had more positive attitudes compared to male criminal justice, as well as female criminal justice compared to male criminal justice. So again, major was not found to have an effect, but gender was. And this fits with the previous research that I had found that women typically have more positive attitudes towards mentally ill people. As far as the TV questions, there was not a strong relationship between the number of TV shows watched and questionnaire scores, or the number of hours watched each week and questionnaire scores. This was a really surprising finding for me, as the existing body of research has found a strong relationship between media, especially these types of crime drama shows, and attitudes towards the mentally ill. So this could suggest that either a turning point has occurred in the media today's portrayal of mentally ill people, so it could be more positive or more nuanced. It could also suggest that people are more discerning when they watch TV shows, so they may not accept these representations wholesale, and they think more critically about what they're seeing on screen. After the median split for high and low attitudes, there was no significant difference for the number of TV shows watched or the number of hours watched. So again, this suggests that there may no longer be a strong impact of crime drama shows on people's attitudes towards mentally ill, whether they be high or low, meaning more positive or less positive attitudes. So some limitation to this study, obviously, as I mentioned, I had to remove quite a few subjects. So in the future, it should have a much larger and a more equal subject pool. Another thing was a majority of respondents were white, so further research should strive for representation of race and ethnicity. And again, a suggestion for future research would be to study the differences between races for the attitudes towards mentally ill people, which there is already some research existing for that. Further directions for this research. So it could look more specifically on which questions males and females differed most strongly on. Another thing that I thought about would be if I only had it as criminal justice or non-criminal justice, but I could break it down further to see if, business majors differed more strongly than art majors or something like that. Additional research could also focus on specific police procedural TV shows. This was also partially inspired by like Criminal Minds, which seems to use mentally ill criminals a lot in their shows, so I could focus more specifically on that. Something I also noticed was that the research I was finding is from like a decade or so ago, so it's a little bit dated at this point. So future research could reanalyze TV shows to see if their depictions of mentally ill people have changed significantly and have maybe become more positive. Another thing was one individual did make their own checkmark of other on the demographics page when I'd asked for gender. So, and they were removed from the study. Future research should also allow an option for gender nonconforming individuals on the demographics page, and one could also investigate trans and non-binary individuals' attitudes towards mentally ill people. Here are my references, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well done, Sam. Very nice presentation. Good job.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Samantha? Oh, no? Just, okay.
No, there's a question.
Go ahead.
Did you look at diagnosis? So individuals diagnosed with a mental illness, because women are more likely to seek help-seeking behaviors in regards to mental illness as well?
I did not look at diagnosis, but it's definitely something that could be done in a future project.
It's also pretty sensitive to ask a question like that. That could have caused IRB complications, which we wouldn't have wanted. We discourage those kinds of questions. So I had a question. So you get a median split, okay? So you have higher versus lower attitudes, but overall, so sometimes your higher versus lower means you have positive attitudes and negative attitudes. Sometimes it could be that you have overall they're positive, just you even more positive or other positive. You follow? So I'm curious about your median split, and were the bottom half on your overall scale, were those still positive attitudes, or were they in fact more negative? Did you understand what I just said?
Yes, I believe it found that they were just less positive, but they weren't necessarily negative.
Yeah. So that could account for the findings. The reason you didn't get a lot of significant findings because overall attitudes toward people with mental illness were positive.
Yeah, that's another thing where it would probably be more beneficial to have a much wider subject pool to get more of a difference.
This is a great example of sometimes if you get statistically non-significant results, but socially, it actually is a good thing. You don't go, okay, that influenced by these kind of TV shows.
Yeah, maybe you've hit on the waning of the CSI effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could be.
Are you going to go on?
I'd like to, yeah.
Good. So the same thing we told Natalie, hurry up, we're not getting any younger.
So there's one change that I have to ask you to make, and this is my fault. I should have emailed you and told you this earlier. Instead of using mentally ill people, mentally ill individuals, you got to flip it. People with mental illness, individuals with mental illness.
Okay, so person-centered language.
Right. So just flip that language. That's what the APA recommends.
Okay. Natalie, are you still on? I don't know if you can hear us, but.
I'm still on.
Okay, listen, also when I noticed in your presentation, and I didn't remember if you had it in your thesis, but when you talk about racial groups and you had white and black, those have to be capitalized. They weren't in your presentation. I don't know why, that just made me think of that.
Okay, I'll make sure that I go back and make sure that they're correctly capitalized.
Okay. So we have a question for Sam.
Yes,
now.
Gina, you have a question?
Okay, so the
Sam
TV
there?
shows that you picked,
Yeah.
did you just focus on like the ones that aren't realistic or like crime
Sam.
files too,
Huh?
or?
It's Natalie. Did she
Could you-
Sam is still there.
I didn't catch it.
Jess, should I repeat it?
Okay, so for your TV, like you looked at like CSI, which are like unrealistic. Did you look at like TV shows that are more realistic, that depict like mentally ill people?
So are you talking about like more of a documentary type reality TV?
Yeah.
That's a good suggestion. I was focused on sort of the fictional TV shows, but that would definitely be interesting to see an actually, someone with mental illness represented on screen, if that had a different effect. That's a good question.
We have two students, the one that just asked your question is one of the two. They're doing, for their thesis, they're doing attitudes toward mentally ill. So that's continued this semester.
Awesome.
Oh, here's the second of the two.
So you wanted to see how the shows affected them, but did you also consider asking if they have any experience with persons with mental illness, like firsthand experience, to see if that also affected their?
That's a good question. I didn't have it on my demographics page, but that was something that I noticed in my research that typically having experience with someone with mental illness usually does have an effect on their attitudes, but I personally did not have it on my demographics page.
Do you have any sage advice for the people who are doing thesis?
Don't procrastinate. Number one on that. Again, I think it was either Natalie or Kim, like ask questions, ask for advice, either from your classmates or your professors, but basically just start working on it right away and keep working on it, because this is not the type of thing to do last minute.
I'm glad you said that because it means something different coming from a colleague than it does from, professors nagging you. Anything else? Any other questions for Sam? You did a great job.
Thank you.
So what we've learned from today's presentations is that women